Following on from templating the rider's seat bones, the angle of the rider's ribcage connection with their pelvis can provide a lot of information about how stable they are as a rider. Riders must absorb the horse's vertical forces in their own body. This is not only for the horse's comfort and stability and performance, but their own, as being unable to counter those forces could increase their potential for bouncing in the saddle, however slight, and result in back pain. So I look at the angle of the ribcage positioning in relation to the pelvis, and at the same time assess their potential for developing back strain. Looking at these 6 examples, and except for one, their shoulders are in line with their hip joints, but they vary in lumbar curves and ribcage angle. The first one has fairly good alignment with the ribs aimed into her pelvis. She's a teenager and a well-balanced rider. The second one, the ribs are aligned slightly over the front of her pelvis and thighs. She's a skilled show jumper over 1.20 m jumps. The third one has a marked anterior tilt of the pelvis, and her ribcage is even more in advance of her pelvis. It was recommended that she strengthen her core with floor-lying sit-ups, and you can see she's adopting a habitual sit-up posture because that exercise did not target her back to promote a vertical upper body posture. And that's the problem with exercises, is that you still have to get a balance in the muscle development with whatever exercise you're doing and however you're doing it. The fourth has a similar issue of the ribcage loading in front of her hip joint. It's obvious that the strain point is in her thoracolumbar region around L1, and this rider has a history of chronic back pain for many years. The fifth is close to ideal, although very slightly loading the ribcage in front of her pelvis. But there's no exaggeration of her lumbar curve. There is a very marked planting of the ribcage or stacking of the ribs over her pelvis. Same for the sixth, although there is a marked lumbar curve. Number 7 is ideal. She's a successful regional riding club dressage rider. See how the upper body of ribs and shoulders are stacked above her pelvis without an exaggerated lumbar curve. I worked with her to align her rotationally through her shoulders and pelvis to develop a firm connection between the bony triangle made by her seat bones against the saddle, and that successfully resolved her postural alignment anomalies. And canter. So left hip forward, just a centimetre. Whatever the imprint was, let's see if we can equalise it up to the right. Yes. Marvellous. The last example has a vertical rib cage, which is good, but again there is slightly anterior positioning in front of her pelvis. In my experience, a rider whose rib cage is aligned in front of their pelvis tip forwards in the saddle. And think of the lack of support in the lumbar region where there is only the spine and the soft tissue there. The ribs are a relatively solid, stable structure above it, and the pelvis makes a relatively stable structure below it, although it can tilt. This is why developing the core muscles to achieve a stable connection between the rib cage and the pelvis is so important for riders that have to deal with vertical forces coming from the horse. These postural misalignments of rib cage and pelvic connection can be exacerbated when the rider takes up an astride seating position in the saddle, and this is where the saddle seat shape will either support an effective posture or exacerbate the loading alignment.